Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first Merry Talk of our ninth season. My name is Philip Duggins, and I am with the Alumni Engagement Office here at Mary Washington. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. We are excited to host a sizable audience of over 350 participants for tonight's presentation, which includes alumni, students, parents, and friends from across the country and beyond. As with past lectures, there will be time after the presentation for our guests to answer any questions you might have. Feel free to ask a question by clicking on the Q&A icon below and submitting there, or you can vote for other submitted questions to help them rise to the top of the list. At this time, I'd like to introduce Sally Berkeley Harnish, class of 2022. Sally, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sally Harnish, and as mentioned before, I'm class of 2022, and I have the privilege today of introducing Dr. Stephen Farnsworth, who is not only a wonderful professor, but an amazing mentor and scholar. Dr. Farnsworth is a professor of political science and international affairs and is the director of the Center for Leadership and Media Studies at UMW. He is also an author or co-author of 9 books on the presidency, mass media, public opinion, and journalism. This includes his most recent book, Late Night in Washington, Political Humor and the American Presidency. He has received the Virginia Outstanding Faculty Award from the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia and 3 campus-wide teaching awards. During the spring of 2024, Dr. Farnsworth served as the Poland U.S. Fulbright Distinguished Scholar in Humanities and Social Sciences at the American Studies Center of the University of Warsaw. Beyond academics, Dr. Farnsworth was and is still heavily involved in political commentary, working as a newspaper journalist for 10 years before becoming a professor and now providing political commentary to a wide range of media outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, PBS NewsHour, and BBC World. With his immense experience and published writings, Dr. Farnsworth is an expert on all things media and politics. Without further ado, I will now turn it over to Dr. Farnsworth.
Thank you so much, Sally, for this kind introduction. Sally's very modest. It's important for us to recognize her as well. She is an editor at the Law Review at William and Mary Law School, and is already, as she starts her final year as a law school student, set up to work as a clerk to a federal judge in D.C., and then go into private practice in Washington. And so she's an all-star. She was a research assistant for me, but she has done extraordinarily well in the years since she graduated, walking off Ball Circle. I'm delighted to be here to talk to all of you today about disinformation and the role that political humor can play in countering it. Now, I'm thankful for the invitation to speak with the alumni organization, and I had a chance to look at some of the names on the list of people who have RSVP'd for tonight, and it's a wonderful collection of ghosts of semesters past for me. And so thank you all, even though we all looked a lot younger when we last met in person. I am grateful for your interest in this topic. Now, I should say that we have an all hands on deck moment when it comes to thinking about the role of false information and its prominence in our political system. I used to be a former daily newspaper journalist, and my view is that journalism simply cannot keep up with the tidal wave of falsehood that's out there. In fact, any aggressive challenging of late night comedy is often dismissed by partisans who don't want to hear their favorite politicians or their favorite news outlets being called for that kind of content. And so I think we'll start talking about disinformation first, and then bring political humor into the conversation as well. I think that while most of my research is focused on the US political system, this political disinformation is a global problem. I really noticed this a great deal during my time in Poland this last year, where there is a relentless stream of falsehoods coming from the Russian government and its trolls. It's pervasive in American political discourse. It's also pervasive there in Russia. Now, I'm going to show some slides, and I'm going to show a clip to give you a sense of some of the main arguments that I'm working with. Part of what I have to say relates to public opinion data, and it's always easier when you're talking about numbers to show summary statistics rather than talk about them. So this project, this conversation really does bring together my two most recent books, The Late Night in Washington, Political Humor in the American Presidency, and Producing News in a Time of Disinformation. I want to be clear about what disinformation is. There are sort of three types of information disorder, and disinformation, what we're talking about here, is the deliberate, manipulated content or fabricated content that's designed to support conspiracy theories or to discredit accurate information. Misinformation on the left side of the screen, in contrast, is more a product of accident rather than design. Like when a reporter hears millions and writes billions.
Your screen is not being shared?
I'm sorry?
The screen is not being shared where everyone can see it right now?
Let me see what we can do to make that work. So when we talk about disinformation, we're talking about the fabricated, deliberately manipulated content that's designed to create conspiracy theories or to support them. When we talk about misinformation, in contrast, we're talking about something that's more a product of accident than design, like when a reporter hears millions and writes billions. And then malinformation is things like revenge porn that is nevertheless very damaging, but less relevant to our conversation about political discourse. And it's a very useful metric, I think, to divide this disinformation in various categories, because it's clear that we have to pay a great deal of attention to the content that is in our public discourse. After all, citizens need accurate information to make sound decisions regarding candidates they support for office, as well as reevaluating and evaluating public policy options. Without accurate information, citizenship is very challenging indeed. Now, falsehood achieves its goal if at least one of three things happens. One, a person might believe something that's false is true, or they might believe that something's true that is false. But they also can give up hope, thinking that anything is true. And that level of disengagement coming from disinformation is perhaps particularly dangerous, because when you think about people who just don't even believe the truth is out there, there is a great, great danger of them believing whatever false information is out there, because their critical reasoning has just simply dismissed all of this content. Now, when we look at surveys, I want to use a bit of a case study with the COVID dynamic. We know that the most informed people use news websites and apps. They use radio, print, and television news. The least informed people tend to rely on social media. And this is precisely where disinformation is likely to flourish. I'm going to use three COVID conspiracy theories as an example of what I'm talking about here. On this slide, we've got three false claims relating to COVID. One, that powerful people planned COVID for their own purposes. This is the so-called plandemic. They didn't. The other one is that vitamin C is an effective treatment to prevent COVID. It isn't. And the third option, that there is a connection between the then new 5G technology and the COVID virus. Again, there isn't a connection. In all three cases, the people who rely mostly on social media would have heard a lot about these falsities. Now, these conspiracy theories have major consequences. People who imagine that something is amiss in terms of what's going on here are less likely to take COVID seriously, which means they are doing less to protect themselves and less to protect their family. We know all too well that in the US, the per capita death rates were much higher than in other advanced democracies. And vaccination rates in the United States were lower than other societies at comparable levels of economic development. Now, when we think about this dynamic, you can see the political realities of the moment. When the crisis first emerged, the COVID crisis, Donald Trump was president and he sought to minimize the pandemic. He said that it would disappear with the coming of spring. He encouraged people to live normally, at least at first. He himself continued to hold mass rallies and large public events, regardless of the risk involved as the 2020 election drew closer. And then Trump even mused, of course, about ingesting bleach as a treatment. No, don't do that, by the way, it's dangerous. And many of Trump's efforts to minimize the crisis were amplified on conservative media like Fox News and on peer-to-peer social messaging. Now, Joe Biden, in contrast, running against Trump for president at that time, urged people to wear masks, to avoid large gatherings, and to take care of themselves and each other. And he practiced what he preached. He basically campaigned for president in 2020, largely through videos and through social distancing in terms of interactions with people when necessary. And this has real consequences, this false information. And let me give you an example of that. If you look at COVID vaccination rates in the United States, about 18 months after the vaccine became widely available in this country, you can see the dynamics about the states that are highly vaccinated versus the states that are low in comparison to the other states. So I have the top 10 on the left side of the screen, the bottom 10 on the right. The states won by Trump, those are states with more red politics. They're more likely to consume conservative media, and they're more likely to be more likely to listen to Donald Trump. You can see that the lowest vaccination rates, 9 of the 10, were states that Trump won in 2020. The one exception is Georgia, where the margin, as we all know from Trump's famous phone call to Georgian state officials, was a 12,000 vote margin. So, and then on the left side of this screen, these are the states with the highest vaccination rates. You'll notice Maryland and Virginia, of course, made the top 10, above all the New England states at the top of the list. And so these are, of course, all blue states in the 2020 election. And so you can see just how this dynamic works. Now, I don't want to overwhelm you with data, but if I were to show you a similar chart with death rates per capita during this period of time, you'll see the same thing. Red states had much higher death rates during these COVID outbreaks compared to what they were pre-COVID. So people, to put it simply, were willing to risk their lives and the lives of their families for conspiracy theories. When you think about the January 6th attack on the Capitol, which happened despite there being no evidence that the 2020 election was stolen, you can also see that people were willing to risk going to jail for conspiracy theories. Now, since there are some journalists in the room, I want to take a moment about how journalism is trying to confront disinformation before we look to political humor. Journalism can do a great job with fact-checking stories, but the reality is that there is no way that the news business, particularly in these financially precarious times, that anyone can do an effective countering of all the false information that's important that gets out there anyway. And so you see that there are a great deal of political benefits, at least as some politicians see it, when they tell false information. It seems to work for them, particularly with the level of credibility that they get. Now, so part of this is going to be on us as news consumers, as citizens looking for information to make our judgments. And this is a method of sort of rapid assessment of questionable information. The key thing here, and if anybody wants the slides, I can make them available, or just email me about that. But the basic idea here is that you have this is a program put together by Michael Caulfield of the University of Washington, Vancouver, is that basically you can think very quickly something is likely to be problematic in terms of its truth. And that is particularly notable when there's an emotional reaction that comes from what you hear. We could talk more about this if you like, but this is a way to sort of quickly maybe think about what doesn't seem right and think about it further. Now, given past research in political humor, it might seem odd to think that political humor is a mechanism, if you will, for dealing with the battle against disinformation. But from the earliest films of Charlie Chaplin, if not before, political humor has historically mocked all political figures, regardless of political orientation, and increased the citizen cynicism about politics. And so we know historically, when we think about political humor and its history, historically very, very critical of all political figures and a vehicle for generating more cynicism about the political system. Now, political humor, though, on the other side of the coin, is a particularly effective technique for shaping learning about politics. The key issue here is that for people who are not naturally political junkies, political humor can be a mechanism to get people to learn more about politics. And public opinion data show us that's exactly what happens. A joke about Mitch McConnell is not funny if you don't know who Mitch McConnell is or what he does. And so to the extent that someone will look at political humor, it might be the thin edge of the wedge, if you will, that gets people more interested in politics. And this change is particularly noticeable with younger adults, the people who are not political junkies, the people who are finding their way in the political world, plus the people who might have more of an attention span for late night humor than people who are older. Now, of course, political humor today is not just at 11:30. You have the ability to share via peer-to-peer communication. And of course, the political humorists themselves are going to be posting this material on social media. They have their own YouTube pages and their own ability to use social media to connect with clips and the like. So there is this dynamic of learning that occurs in this vehicle. And it's important to note that the information and messaging can be offered in a less threatening or strident way. I think one of the reasons that some people are really turned off to politics these days is just how much anger and vitriol there is throughout this conversation. And so what political humor offers a chance to get people who are listening to think about the absurdity of some of the claims being made in public life. I want to show you a clip from a John Oliver program. Again, this relates to COVID. From May of 2021. It's about a minute long, but it'll give you a sense of how a lighter touch can be employed to engage in political learning and to counter disinformation. John Oliver is on HBO. He's an alum of The Daily Show, which was part of the resurgence of political humor over the last couple of decades.
Since the start of the month, a worrying trend.
Vaccine demand declining in South Carolina. Some providers left with extra doses and appointments are wide open.
Palm Beach County Healthcare District says it is now facing 10,000 appointments for the county's vaccine sites remain unfilled since they opened this week.
Appointments are going unfilled. We've got thousands of appointments available over the next few weeks and no takers at this point.
It's true. A worrying amount of people are holding off on getting the free COVID vaccine. And I'm not saying that you should immediately get something just because it's free. I wouldn't recommend getting these old dolls on Craigslist just because they're free. They're weird, broken, and they will kill you in your sleep. But these vaccines could save not just your life, but the lives of people around you. And it's genuinely dispiriting that just a few months into the vaccine rollout, we are already at this point. And the problem is, for the coronavirus, the herd immunity threshold is thought to be between 70 and 90% of the population. But a survey found that while 60% of American adults have got or want to get the vaccine, another 18% say maybe, and 22% say no. And if you're thinking, well, hold on, if every maybe gets the vaccine, that still puts us at 78%. Unfortunately, that poll doesn't take into account children who we're not vaccinating right now and who make up around 22% of the population. So we need to get the vaccine into as many adults as possible as soon as possible. And that means you really need to get vaccinated. And obviously, I mean the collective you, but also you, Mike in Baltimore. I know you've got this on in the background at work on Monday, so listen to me. Schedule your vaccine, Mike. Don't say you're going to look into it later. Just Google Vaccine Finder Baltimore. It takes seconds. Here are a list of vaccine sites in your area. And if you're thinking, yeah, I'm not sure I need it, Joe Rogan says I'm probably fine. Look, it is true. You might not get seriously sick from COVID, or indeed sick at all. but you could still inadvertently pass it to someone who could then die. And before you say, well, vulnerable people should just get vaccinated then, the vaccines are only 95% effective, Mike, so they'll probably be okay, but maybe not. Also, the more the virus circulates, the likelier we'll see mutations that make it more dangerous, possibly helping it to evade the vaccine completely, putting us all the way back to square one. So get the
Now, what you saw in this clip and this show last week, tonight on HBO, involves 20-minute humorous deep dives into significant policy issues, is not something that's necessarily going to focus on issues that are going to generate a lot of laughs. You have healthcare, campaign finance reform, bankruptcy laws have all been topics on the Last Week Tonight program. But what this does in this particular clip that you just saw, there was a very light touch about getting the vaccine, including important information about how to get the needed information about where you can get it and what it can mean for the health of your family members and the community. The idea of the coverage rates and the effectiveness rates, these may reach people who would dismiss dry news reports that contain the same information. What I have here on this slide is the sources of learning about the 2020 presidential election. And one of the things that is really important to appreciate about the way in which late night comedy is part of our political discourse is the extent to which people learn things about the election from these late night shows. In this study of learning in the 2020 presidential election, 40% of adults under the age of 30 report learning something about the campaign, the presidential campaign, from these late night programs. This traditionally is the group the least interested in politics. And so the level of learning on late night comedy for this group is particularly high when you compare it to some of the other groups, like the and to some of the other news outlets. If you think about the late night comedy shows, they're about as significant as radio or newspapers for this age group. 25% overall of the population says they learned something about the election from these comedy programs. Now, those numbers, of course, are smaller than the cable news or the local news or the news websites. But remember, political humor is primarily about entertainment. And so that there is so much learning going on in these shows, which are not designed to compete with evening news programs on CNN or Fox News or elsewhere, really does speak to how important this is as a vehicle. Now, the studies by the Washington Post and others demonstrate that political lies have become very, very common in recent years. And as late night comics increasingly point out the hypocrisies or the gaps between what politicians say and do, what they say today, what they said yesterday, what they do today, what they did yesterday, you can see that something is really becoming more and more prominent in terms of political accountability in our political system. The hosts are getting more aggressive, and their attacks on deceit have become much more commonplace over the last 8 years. Now, what you see, of course, is a very one-sided narrative in terms of political humor on these late-night comedy shows. They were much more inclined in 2020 to focus on Trump and to make fun of Trump compared to Joe Biden. The reality, of course, is that Trump lends himself to political humor in some ways more than Joe Biden did as a candidate. There is an example that Jimmy Kimmel once said in an interview about Trump. "I don't want to talk about Donald Trump every night," Kimmel said. "None of us do, but he gives us no choice. If he sat in the White House all day working on things, I would never mention him. But just today, his former campaign chief was sentenced to prison for the second time in a week. He called himself the most successful president in history, and he tweeted to say that his wife has not been replaced by a body double." Kimmel asks, "I'm not supposed to mention these things?" Now, rather than undermine public respect for the political system, it seems that the late night comedy now is in the business of having a role in supporting the system by calling out this false information. This is particularly true, it seems, in the wake of Donald Trump's refusal to accept the results of the 2020 election. And the court rulings, of course, along with that confirmed Joe Biden legitimately won the election. So in this slide, I give you some sense of the data here. For people who learn about the election from comedy, that is, that they're getting political news from political humor, the dynamic here really speaks to the dynamic where the people with the highest levels of trust say that they're the ones who learned something about the election, and those with lower levels of trust less likely to have learned from political humor about this dynamic. Now, I know some of you who studied statistics with me would say a crosstab analysis, a bivariate comparison only gets us so far. And so what you see in this slide is a multivariate examination of the same question. This is a more thorough quantitative test using logistic regression. For the non-academics here, this slide is a more complicated way of saying what I just said. That is, late night comedy no longer is building cynicism in the political system, at least in the year after the January 6th attack on the Capitol. For those of you with statistical training, you can see here that the importance of political trust and the connection between political trust and learning is a powerful factor in this multivariate equation. It's more important than the issues of education or party identification or the individual's vote choice in 2020. Now, age is a stronger variable in this equation, but of course, the political humor audience skews younger. So there's going to be a much more powerful impact with age, of course, because of the dynamics of who is watching these shows. Now, there are some caveats here. This survey was taken in September 2021. It would have been better to have had that survey conducted right after the election, but COVID impacted the ability to get the survey completed. Similarly, the grant that funded this survey stipulated that it was conducted in Virginia and not nationally. And so we do have the data here in this equation from Virginians, but it is important to note that Virginia looks a good deal like America in terms of its politics, in terms of its demographics. It'll be interesting to see if this system building dynamic of the 2020 election and its aftermath is reflected in the conversation in 2024. But of course, we're just beginning to look at the 2024 election and media content and political humor in this election cycle. Now, I just have one more slide, and then we'll be able to open it up for questions. I think it's clear from the data here that political humor these days has far more political influence in challenging disinformation than one might have expected, given that the format was designed mainly to entertain. And it's important to remember that late night comedy has an impact in countering disinformation, particularly for younger adults and those who do not get a lot of news elsewhere, which might make them more vulnerable to disinformation. It also challenges disinformation in a way that is less threatening, more accessible than conventional news programming. If you think about the fact checks that are the norm on television news or in print journalism, you can recognize that a lot of people will disrespect these news outlets, and so they will disrespect the content, particularly if it's critical of someone that they already like. So when you have a political figure challenging another political figure, or you have a media outlet that in the minds of some that is seen as partisan, challenging that disinformation, that challenge could be easily rejected by somebody looking at this as a he said, she said kind of situation. Political humor, though, these are people whose real importance in our political system is that they themselves are, quote, powerless in this dynamic. They're not elected officials. They're not running for president. They're simply pointing out the absurdity, not unlike a medieval court jester who didn't make policy in the state, but nevertheless might be able to speak truth in the political discourse in a way that people who are closer to the king might not be able to do. Now, the theory for what's going on here is that that the same kind of challenging of authority that political humor has done since Chaplin's time, or even the ancient Greeks, if we want to go all the way back to Aristophanes. The idea here is that you're making fun of the powerful. There's the old saying that that good comedy punches up, that people sort of at the bottom of the heap are making fun of the people at the top, the elites. Good comedy punches up, bad comedy, the theory says, punches down. And so by presenting themselves as powerless figures, or relatively removed from the political discourse, the day-to-day Democratic versus Republican fighting on Capitol Hill, these political humorists can be very, very effective. I think that this is a dynamic that, because of the dynamics of the 2020 election, where the person in charge of the political system was actually trying to stop the legitimate, peaceful transfer of power in the wake of the 2020 election, encouraging protest, encouraging people to reject the actions of Congress, encouraging people to simply ignore the court rulings, ignoring the evidence from the state courts and the governors and all the others providing all the dynamics of our electoral college system operating, rejecting all of that. By making fun of somebody who was in the business of trying to stay in power despite what the court said, what the governor said, what members of Congress said, you see a system building dynamic here. Because when the president is challenging the system, as Donald Trump did around January 6th, then an attack on people in positions of power like Donald Trump is actually a system strengthening dynamic. And so I think that that's the reason why the results after 2020 suggest that political humor can be a system building dynamic, are greater than they ever were in any previous study that we've done before 2020. I think that has to do with the unique consequences, the unique circumstances of the 2020 election, Donald Trump, and January 6th. Like I say, the big challenge, I think, for people who study political humor and looking at this bizarre, or at least unexpected, dynamic with respect to the 2020 impact on political humor and public opinion, is to see whether this continues to exist. One part of the story we already know. That the fact is that the late night comedy is continuing to emphasize the issues relating to Donald Trump. Now that Joe Biden is no longer the nominee and has been replaced by Vice President Harris, the dynamic hasn't really changed. Donald Trump is still the focus of all this humor. Now, I haven't had much of a chance to discuss this in the question and answer, and hopefully we'll get to this in a moment. But I do think one other thing to appreciate is that conservative political humor has really had a challenging road. In the years since the rise of Saturday Night Live in the 1970s, there have been efforts to try to build a conservative humor messaging that was sort of like the late night comedy of the Johnny Carson era, of the Jay Leno era, of the Jimmy Fallon era, and Stephen Colbert today. So there have been efforts by conservatives to try to create something like this. But in many ways, conservative political humor has struggled to gain an audience, even on Fox News. The show that is on now, Gutfeld, is the most successful effort in the history of conservative political comedy. It's already, just a few years in, competitive in terms of audience share with the established shows like Late Night and The Tonight Show. So there is a way to do this. But historically, it's been a real challenge for conservative humor to make an audience of successful a television program. In many ways, it's sort of the mirror image of liberals struggling with talk radio. I think talk radio is really, really a vehicle for putting out anger and expressing that hostility. But political humor involves a certain ambiguity, a certain play that may not be the natural strong suit of conservative discourse. You can't really make jokes about immigrants. These are people who are struggling to stay alive as they cross the desert. You can make jokes about presidents. And so the dynamics of many of the targets of conservative political discourse don't necessarily lend themselves to political humor. And so what Gutfeld has been able to do, and he's been very, very successful about it, is to be sufficiently self-deprecating in terms of the way that he approaches political humor, so that he can, in fact, answer this by presenting himself as that kind of powerless voice like the political humorists of more liberal persuasion. And so I think that one of the really interesting things about our 2024 political humor dynamic is the rise of Gutfeld. And it'll be interesting to see as the election progresses how that works out for him. So with that last caveat, let me stop sharing the screen, and I will open it up to handing it back to Philip for the question and answer part of our conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Farnsworth. We appreciate the information. And once again, as a reminder for everyone that's participating, if you do have a question, you simply go to the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A block. Just click on that, and you'll see a box that will pop up. And you'll see other questions that have been submitted. You can vote on those to have them go higher to the top. But then also there's a place for you to be able to ask questions there. So if you have any questions, please enter them there. But we will go ahead and get started with what we've got here. This is from Eileen, and it says, I find watching Last Week Tonight and The Daily Show as the only way I can digest my news when it's volatile. Was this why Jon Stewart decided to return, if only one evening a week?
Yeah, I think that the return of Jon Stewart speaks to the all hands on deck moment that we're talking about here in political discourse in America, particularly with respect to the growing number of falsehoods that are being told by public officials. And so I do think that makes a great deal of sense for there to be for Jon Stewart to return to The Daily Show. It also happened that The Daily Show was in the midst of a transition at the time that Jon Stewart started his Monday program, because of course Trevor Noah, the older host, had decided to leave the program, and so they were in the process of figuring out how to redesign this, what kind of a person might be the new host. And so as the transition, which is bad for audience share, was taking place, they brought back Jon Stewart. It makes sense. It's in the ways of many of the superhero movies of today. You see the Marvel heroes come back for another run as they create another successful media product.
Okay. Next question: what is your favorite political cartoon image, comedic material you have ever encountered? Mine is the comic strip of Nancy Pelosi on a broomstick, like the Wicked Witch of the West, with the smoke in the sky that says "Surrender, Trump," a play on the Wizard of Oz.
Well, that's clever. I will have to say that my favorite political humor is actually the work of Charlie Chaplin. I really love his early films. I think he was a comedic genius. And for those people who are really interested in Charlie Chaplin's work, I actually have a Great Lives presentation, another Mary Washington connection with the alumni on Charlie Chaplin and political humor and his political discourse. I think he had a very keen sense of the powerlessness that the tramp figure in particular could have in the face of the very powerful dynamics of the day, whether these are police officers or immigration officials or other voices of authority. Perhaps in many cases, Chaplin was very concerned about kids being pulled into orphanages. That was, of course, part of his personal life as a young child. So he was always very sensitive to kids being removed to orphanages. And so in Charlie Chaplin, you see just this mocking of authority that is really indiscriminate. It's just, if you have power, I'm going to kick you in the backside if I can get away with it. It's a style of humor that in many ways shaped political humor that followed in the decades. If you look at Charlie Chaplin, you can see where Mel Brooks got some of his ideas. You can see the sort of antics, physical antics of the early Chevy Chase or Dick Van Dyke. I mean, there is even a scene in one of his films that is recaptured by Lucille Ball in her show that followed decades later. So I absolutely encourage all of you, for an interest in this kind of dynamic of humor and political humor, to spend a little time with Charlie Chaplin, one of the true geniuses of film, but also of political humor.
Okay. Political humor in the vein of Daily Show, Colbert Report, Last Week Tonight has been around for a few decades now. Do you see a difference between those consuming this sort of political humor for longer and those who are younger and have less exposure to this and more modern social media?
Well, I think the hosts have had to adapt to the changing environment of the world today. The reality is that people do not stay up till 11:30 in great numbers to watch this show, particularly as they get older and they have to get to work in the morning. Maybe college students who make sure that they don't have a 9 a.m. class can indulge in late night television. But the reality is that most people are watching this on their schedule. They look at it later. The shows are on YouTube. There are clips in social media and memes and all other sorts of things that are out there. And so there is a dynamic that some people are going to use different formats or different channels to get to this political humor. And I'm guessing that our research and public opinion might underestimate the impact of political humor, in part because of so much that's happening sort of off the television grid in the world of social media and peer-to-peer sharing and things like that. And so there is a very different dynamic in terms of how people will consume it. You will get younger people looking at clips rather than the entire segments. The political audience, though, for these shows, particularly if you have a political guest on, that can be substantial. And for the politicians, it's a great opportunity too. If you think about the average candidate who is going to be quoted on a television segment, they might have 8 or 10 seconds to express their views. That's all the opportunity that they're going to have in their own words to be inserted into a story about something. Whereas if you are on one of these shows for as a guest, you might have 8 or 10 minutes to talk about what you think, and it can be a really humanizing thing, and that can be something that can be really effective. I think that one of the problems that politicians sometimes have today is that they take themselves too seriously, and they convince the public that they're serious, too serious. And so if you can laugh at yourself a little bit, self-deprecating humor can go a long, long way. Ronald Reagan, for members of my audience who can recall back to those years, that's someone who really was a real master of this art. He would make fun of the things that people said about him rather than get angry. I think Donald Trump in some ways might be able to better connect with the country if he didn't have the sort of instinctive, combative, angry response, and occasionally could make light of himself, make a joke about something. But that's just not who Donald Trump is, and it's one of the reasons why Donald Trump has never been all that popular. Ronald Reagan was much, much more popular than Donald Trump throughout his years in office, in part because he could take a joke, but he would also deliver a joke. I'm reminded of the old saying that Ronald Reagan used to like to repeat. He was accused of being lazy, and people would call him lazy, and Ronald Reagan would joke in response. They say hard work never killed anyone, but I say, why take a chance? And so, that kind of dynamic. And so, I don't know if this is a result of the way in which our political culture is changing. It's become so strident, but there is some value, I think, in political figures not taking themselves too seriously, making the occasional joke, and showing people that they're not too stuck on themselves. They don't think too highly of themselves. And that kind of humbling dynamic can endear you to voters. And particularly when you have a world in which almost everyone is reflexively a Republican or reflexively a Democrat, the way to reach those people in the middle is through character, through who you are as a person. Those are not people caring a lot about policy. They care about who you are as a person. And political humor, when offered by a politician, can be an important part of connecting with those voters who are less connected to politics, less focused on issues.
Okay. Next question is, do people pay attention anymore to political cartoons like Mike Lukovich?
Not so much, in all honesty. Unfortunately, there has been a significant challenge for everything that came out of the newspaper business. Now, often these comics are put on screen as through social media. They're shared that way. Their CNN will take political comics and put them on. But the impact that those things used to have, when I grew up before the internet, when I was looking at the political humor, even as a young adult, when I was, first came to Washington in the 1980s, and you'd look at Herb Block and the comics of the Post, and people in Washington were talking about that. It was very central to the conversation of political Washington. There's no real political humorist offering up comedy clips or comedy comics like that has that kind of impact today. For people of a certain age, they might think of Doonesbury as a really powerful dynamic in terms of shaping political discourse during that era. But once again, these dynamics have given way to just a broadening out of what people are consuming in the news, and that means that no one thing is as effective as it might have been, as the leading things were in the past.
Okay. The next one is, did you not hear the news today? I do not think this balanced. So I'm not sure if that's a comment or question or what that's referring to. So, all right, moving on to the next one. I feel like while conservative political humor has flopped on TV, they've had some success on social media, even through avenues like Snapchat. Example, Ben Shapiro, left, right, center. More of a statement than a question, I guess.
Well, I think that's true. I'm really interested in Gutfeld, and in my new political humor book, I have a whole chapter on the rise of Gutfeld, because that is on Fox, and so it is. And originally, it was designed to compete with the Daily Show and Late Night with Stephen Colbert. It was designed to compete at that hour. It now runs an earlier hour, an hour ahead of those programs, so it's not a direct competition. But the audience is very, very effective. One of the things to remember about moving beyond, say, that world of Fox News, it's harder to gauge the impact of that kind of content. The world of social media has a wide range of news consumers. It's not clear that those people who are looking at Ben Shapiro are people that are being persuaded or anything like that. I'm not familiar with public opinion research that has looked at that programming in great detail. It's something that we don't know a lot about in political science, in part because it's sort of hard to get to the bottom of what's going on in terms of political dynamics. Because when you do survey research, you want to find people who are using the product in great numbers. We have a survey that has 1,000 people in it, say. How many of those 1,000 people would be listening to that show? It might not be that many, and so we might not be able to generalize effectively when you're thinking about valid statistics about who these people are and what they're like, beyond the sort of general surface observation that they are conservatives who like what they hear on that program.
Okay. Good evening. During the Hollywood strikes, the late night comedy shows were paralyzed, so the Big Five started a podcast called Strike Force 5. Any data, stats on the success of that short-lived but fun to listen to podcast on political comedy output, and whether it reached a different audience or even wider audience? Thank you.
I haven't seen data on that. One of the problems with political science research sometimes is that the refereed journal article process, the point of peer review, the collection of data, these things take a lot of time. And so a lot of the things that you can offer that have been, scrutinized by fellow scholars, that could be a couple of years after the event itself. What little I can offer by way of an answer to this question is that it was the place where the true diehards would go. There were a significant number of people who would watch the late night comedy who would then turn to the podcasts, in part because they were used to it. But there has been some degradation in the audience of late night comedy in the last couple of years. It might have been a result of the strike, that people got used to not consuming as much late night comedy, and the podcast didn't fully replace it. And so they maybe didn't go back to it when the strike was over. I think there may be an issue too, but I can't prove it through data, that the over-reliance on Donald Trump jokes might create a product, because remember, late night comedy is a product. It's on for-profit television networks, that isn't as appealing. That there isn't enough range of material. There isn't enough new stuff. If it becomes too predictable, it can risk losing audience share. So I think there may be some of that going on. The strike had a very powerful impact, and the podcast, while trying to deal with that absence, may not have fully restored or kept that audience share connected to late night comedy and able to go back to it once the strike was resolved.
Do you think there is an impact on the punch-up dynamic with some late-night hosts getting so big in audience and influence? For example, Colbert and Kimmel having Democratic politicians on their shows, and Gutfeld recently having Trump on his show, and, unlike Stewart in his heyday, not cracking jokes or asking any questions that would lend to self-deprecation.
Well, I do think that that it's important to recognize that that in the past you did have Republicans on these late night shows. Back in the days of Leno and Letterman, you had John McCain and Mitt Romney on these shows. Donald Trump himself was a guest host on Saturday Night Live back in the day, long before he was a presidential candidate, to be sure. And so there is a dynamic that the conversation has become more one-sided, that was always on these traditional late night shows like CBS, NBC, ABC's late night and Comedy Central, a dynamic where they were making fun of Republicans more than Democrats. But the gap is now extreme. Instead of 60-40 as it was in Clinton's time, it is now in the 2020 election, for example. It was more than 90% of the jokes about presidential candidates were about Trump and fewer than 10% about Biden. So you can really see the one-sided nature that's there. Presumably, that's where the audience is. These are for-profit companies that are providing a product that they choose to provide, and that's out there. I do think, though, that they can always, these late night comics can always present themselves as not, quote, that powerful a figure, because they aren't actually running for things. They aren't actually saying that they should be a senator or a governor or a president. And so I think, and they, of course, are masters at the self-deprecating humor as well. If they need it, they can use it. So that dynamic is out there. The idea of political humor is not to take itself too seriously at a certain point. Now, this conversation would change completely if Colbert ran for office or something, if he chose to do that, because that's not impossible, right? You have the president of Ukraine right now. Zelensky was a comedy star in Ukrainian television before he became president. Now, I remember thinking when Zelensky was first elected that was an odd choice for Ukraine to make, given the threat it faced from Russia. That you would choose somebody who was a political neophyte, who was just playing a politician on TV to be your president. But the reality is that Zelensky has been an extraordinarily effective president, given the threats that Ukraine faces. And to this day, Zelensky certainly, in some ways, was a man for the moment. We have elected movie stars presidents. We have elected reality show stars presidents. Maybe someday we'll, in the United States, elect a comedy host president. We'll have to see.
Is there any evidence of people who consume late night comedy voting at higher rates than people who do not watch late night?
Yes. It's a higher. What we know is that there's a higher level of political interest. We know that there's a higher level of political knowledge, and we see that there is an increasing tendency to register to vote and to vote. This is in part because this skews younger. These are people who are not already registered in many cases, the 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds. And that's where the audience for this show is. And so when we look, we see that concentration of impact among the under 30 voters in our system. In many ways, I think that for people who are kind of turned off to politics, late night comedy could be something along the lines of a gateway drug to political discourse, to political conversations, that people start to think more about politics, they talk more about politics, they're more comfortable in the world of political conversations because of late night humor. And then, voting is simply the next step on that that process of learning.
What do you think about Bill Maher and Real Time?
Well, I haven't looked at that show as much as the other shows. I'm not really I'm not all that taken with it personally. And so, the idea of political humor, I think, is that there's a wide range of voices out there, and they can be very effective to give people a range of options. The clip that I showed you of John Oliver, for example, this is a 20-minute policy deep dive. That's very different than the way that, say, Jimmy Fallon or Stephen Colbert would make jokes about political figures. We haven't talked about it yet, but I would also note that, Saturday Night Live is continuing to do these things 50 years later. If you think about other shows that are out there, there is, of course, we studied Samantha Bee in her program. It's been canceled, but that was another one that we looked at in addition to the nightly program. So there is a range of political humor, and the idea that some people are going to like some, other people are going to like others. Among the leading late night hosts, our data suggests that the NBC Tonight Show Jimmy Fallon program is a little less harsh to Trump than some of the others. At least that was the case in 2020. Jimmy Fallon, of course, had Trump on his show before the 2016 election. And of course, The Apprentice was an NBC product. So there is perhaps a dynamic where you can go to these individual programs and find something to your liking. And so if you want to watch a late night show, but you think maybe there's too much Trump content, maybe, the Fallon alternative is better than the Colbert for you.
Not to go down a Chaplin rabbit hole, but do you think Chaplin's political humor is more powerful when it's combined with a heartfelt, serious warning, such as in The Dictator? And do you see parallels with this approach in Jon Stewart or John Oliver?
Well, I'm perfectly ready to go down the Chaplin rabbit hole. So I thank you for the question. I actually would suggest, if you were to look at one Chaplin film, that you would choose Modern Times, where this famous scene of Charlie Chaplin being caught in the machinery. And that dynamic is that you're talking about, that heartfelt speech, is from another Chaplin film, The Dictator, which is in 1940, where Chaplin basically portrays a Hitler parody. And I personally have never really liked that last scene in the film. I think the film made its point before we got there, but Chaplin owned his own movie studio. He put together the film he wanted to put together, and that's how he ended it. Like I said, I prefer Chaplin's 1936 work to his 1940 work, but that's my preference. But I do think that that kind of heartfelt dynamic has an audience, that people do like it, they do believe in it, and certainly when you think about the way that Jon Stewart offers up a very earnest narrative, if you will, there is a dynamic sort of like that last scene with Chaplin in the current version of Jon Stewart, in the way that he's approaching politics.
Then the next question: what is your opinion of The View?
I think The View is a really interesting place for people, again, who are not necessarily political junkies. You can get political figures on, you have a range of opinions, and the conversation can be appealing to people who would maybe not want to watch Meet the Press on Sunday morning, but still would want some political conversation. They have a range of political figures on The View, and a range of political discourse on The View. And so for people who are oriented towards if you will, the less hard news fare, but still want to be informed, that's one of the places you could go for that kind of content.
The next, and this will actually be our final question, as we've reached the end of our time, but this will be our last question. So, other media: YouTube, satellite radio, Smirkanish, who promotes political cartoons in his newsletter, TikTok and Reddit can expose people to other opinions, exposure, and also use humor. Do surveys show any influence of these other media sites?
Well, I think it's important to note that a lot of this material isn't segregated to one media channel. You know, when you think about late night comedy, that's TV, that's cable, that's clips on YouTube, that's links on Twitter, or X as it's known now. You have all this kind of content that's coming in all these different directions. And in all honesty, in political science, we're kind of struggling to deal with these various channels to be sure that we're catching all the political impact that's out there. But the reality is that anything can go viral at any time from anyone in any place. If it's the right connection, the right message for the moment, it becomes this huge, huge thing. And we all know those famous images of, oh, I don't know, a couple dancing and this woman screaming in this guy's ear or something like that. These kinds of narratives that get repurposed and repackaged and reused, and then we forget about it and then they come back. And so there are all these different ways in which we can have the narratives of our political discourse being redesigned and reconfigured for different audiences at different media at different times. And so it really is a wonderful opportunity in our political and cultural and media environments of these days to have such a wide range of content. We can all find things we like if we look hard enough. And that's, I think, one of the marks that you can say about our time and our political conversation, particularly relating to political humor. There are all kinds of products, all kinds of channels, all kinds of hosts that you can go to find something that can work for you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Farnsworth, for joining us this evening. I'd also like to thank Mark Simpkins from Events AV, who helped facilitate the virtual logistics of tonight's program. And thanks again to our viewers at home for joining us and being part of the conversation. Remember that this presentation will be available for viewing on the UMW YouTube channel by this time next week. There you can watch this program and browse the full catalog of Mary Talks. Our 9th season of Mary Talks will continue later this fall. Keep an eye out for more information for our next presentation. We look forward to seeing you then, if not earlier. Thank you and good night.